Babylon's most famous monument is the one its own king never clearly recorded. The Hanging Gardens are taught as terraces, heavy with soil and trees, rising above a flat, burning plain, watered by machinery far ahead of its time. Yet no structure matching that description has been securely identified in the excavated remains of Babylon. Archaeologists mapped its palaces, temples, walls, processional way, and Ishtar Gate. The city surrendered physical proof of its real greatness. It has not surrendered the Hanging Gardens. That absence does not prove they never existed. Mud brick dissolves, rivers shift their beds, large areas remain unexcavated. A lost structure could still lie buried or washed away, but the challenge is sharper than missing foundations. Every element of the wonder's identity can be questioned. Its city, its builder, its queen, its river, and the love story attached to it. Nearly 300 miles to the north, another king left a different kind of record. He described raising a high garden beside his palace, planted to resemble a mountain landscape. He built canals and an aqueduct to sustain it. His descendants carved images of irrigated royal paradises into stone. The garden may have been real. The address may be wrong. If Nebuchadnezzar II built the Hanging Gardens, he should be this investigation's most important witness. He ruled Babylon from 605 to 562 BC. His inscriptions celebrate temples, palaces, fortifications, streets, and gates. Building displayed devotion to the gods and authority over the empire. He wanted posterity to know what he created. Yet no contemporary inscription from his reign describes the elevated wonder recorded centuries later. Deep soil on vaults, large trees, complex water-lifting machinery, and continuous labor. Silence alone proves nothing. Archives are incomplete. A garden may have carried another name, or its records may be lost. But later accounts describe a major royal project. Heavy foundations, imported soil, constant maintenance. Nebuchadnezzar advertised lesser works. Why is the most celebrated one absent from his own record? Excavations of his palaces have revealed vast architecture and administrative archives. None has produced a structure broadly accepted as the Hanging Gardens. Babylon preserves overwhelming evidence of Nebuchadnezzar's real achievements. The most famous proof of his greatness arrived centuries after his death. The gardens survived through several classical authors. At first, that seems to offer independent witnesses. In practice, the courtroom is filled with echoes of voices that no longer exist. Herodotus wrote extensively about Babylon in the 5th century BC and left no mention of the gardens. His silence is not decisive. Whether he visited in person remains debated, and even an eyewitness can omit a notable building. The positive descriptions appear later. Diodorus wrote of planted terraces deep enough for large trees. Strabo described vaulted platforms and machines raising water from the Euphrates. Other texts added columns, palm beams, hidden galleries, and differing dimensions. These accounts create a vivid picture. They do not create a clean chain of evidence. The authors lived centuries after Nebuchadnezzar. Some drew on earlier works now lost. Their descriptions overlap enough to suggest shared traditions, yet they contradict one another on construction, irrigation, size, and the ruler responsible. The surviving link that ties the garden directly to Nebuchadnezzar runs through Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing around 280 BC, nearly 3 centuries after the king. His work is lost. The crucial passage reaches us only because Josephus quoted or summarized it much later. Our most important ancient witness is not in the room. We possess a copy of his testimony. The most cinematic explanation for the gardens is also the least securely anchored. Nebuchadnezzar supposedly married a Median princess named Amytis. Homesick for the green mountains of her homeland, she found the flat Babylonian plain unbearable. So the king built an artificial mountain covered in trees to comfort her. In the surviving quotation of Berossus, preserved by Josephus, Nebuchadnezzar's wife does long for a mountainous landscape, but she is not named Amytis in that passage. The name attached itself to the tradition later. Contemporary Babylonian records do not confirm the full romantic biography repeated today. A marriage between Babylonian and Median royalty is historically plausible. That does not convert every later detail into documented fact. Other traditions link monumental building projects to Semiramis, a legendary Assyrian queen. Behind the legend probably stands Shemuramat, a real 9th century BC Assyrian queen. Greek and Roman writers later credited her with cities, roads, and waterworks across impossible spans of time. The garden changed owners even in ancient memory. A Babylonian king, an unnamed Syrian ruler, a legendary Assyrian queen. When a monument drifts so freely between rulers and centuries, its original identity may already have been lost. In 1899, Robert Koldewey began the excavations that turned Babylon from legend into a mapped city. Inside the southern palace, he uncovered a vaulted building unlike anything else on the site. 14 narrow chambers stood beneath heavy masonry. Stone appeared where Babylonian builders normally used brick. Nearby shafts suggested a possible water system. Koldewey proposed that he had found the substructure of the Hanging Gardens. The identification seemed to solve the mystery. Strong vaults could support wet soil and trees. Stone would resist moisture. The shafts appeared to address irrigation. For decades, the missing wonder seemed to have a body. Then the evidence turned against it. The building was smaller than the monument described by classical authors and stood uncomfortably far from the reconstructed line of the Euphrates. Storage vessels were recovered in the complex. Administrative tablets found nearby recorded grain and palace distributions. Most scholars now read the rooms as storage or administrative space, rather than the foundation of an elevated garden. Koldewey advanced a serious archaeological hypothesis. Later research weakened it, and when that identification collapsed, the investigation faced a sharper question. What if the wonder was missing from Babylon because it had never stood there? Roughly 440 kilometers north of Babylon lie the ruins of Nineveh, on the east bank of the Tigris, opposite modern Mosul. In the 7th century BC, Nineveh was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Its king, Sennacherib, ruled from 704 to 681 BC. He expanded the city, built a royal residence he called the Palace Without Rival, reshaped the surrounding landscape, and brought water to the capital through ambitious engineering. Most important, Sennacherib described a remarkable garden in his own inscriptions. He claimed to have raised the ground around his palace as a wonder for all peoples to see. Beside it, he created a high garden, planted with fruit trees and aromatic species, designed to reproduce the landscape of the Amanus Mountains. The parallels are difficult to ignore. A high royal garden, an artificial mountain, imported plants, a palace setting, and an explicit claim to universal wonder. Sennacherib never called his garden the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. His text does not prove that later classical writers were describing his work, but Nineveh possesses something Babylon lacks: a contemporary royal inscription in which a king states that he created a mountain-like royal garden. This grounds Stephanie Dalley's influential, still disputed hypothesis that the famous wonder has been assigned to the wrong city. And Sennacherib was not merely another Mesopotamian ruler. He was the king who destroyed Babylon. Babylon was one of the hardest political problems of Sennacherib's reign. Assyrian control collapsed repeatedly under revolts, rival claimants, and foreign alliances. In 689 BC, after a prolonged rebellion, Sennacherib captured the city. He claimed to have devastated it, destroying temples and buildings, removing sacred objects, and deporting inhabitants. His son, Esarhaddon, later made reconstruction central to his reign. This creates the investigation's sharpest irony. Sennacherib was both Babylon's documented destroyer and the king who recorded a spectacular royal garden at Nineveh. If the northern hypothesis is broadly correct, history reversed their identities. The Garden of Babylon's enemy became Babylon's most romantic monument. There is no evidence Babylonians deliberately appropriated it. Theft is a metaphor here, not an accusation. Any shift would have unfolded through fallen empires, lost archives, copied traditions, legendary queens, and confused geography. Once Nineveh fell, its garden could lose its address. Once Babylon became the dominant symbol of Eastern magnificence, a displaced wonder could find a new home. But a royal inscription remains a royal claim. To sustain living trees on a man-made mountain, Sennacherib needed water on a vast scale. Part of his answer still crosses the landscape beyond Nineveh. A garden large enough to astonish visitors could not survive on royal poetry alone. Its trees required a reliable supply of water. If the garden stood above ground level, that water had to be transported, raised, distributed, and drained without undermining the structure. Sennacherib's engineers built an extensive system of canals and waterworks to supply Nineveh and its cultivated surroundings. Its most dramatic surviving element crosses the Jerwan Valley. There, water once flowed across a monumental limestone aqueduct. An inscription names Sennacherib and states that he directed water over a great distance toward Nineveh. Its excavators estimated that the structure contained well over 2 million stones, sealed with waterproof material. The ruins still stand. This is not a later Greek description. It is physical infrastructure from Sennacherib's own reign. One disputed inscription has been read as describing cast bronze technology for a screw-like water-lifting device, potentially earlier than Archimedes. That reading remains contested. No complete Assyrian water screw has been recovered, and Sennacherib cannot safely be called its inventor. The Nineveh case does not rest on the screw. The canal network shows the king could move water across difficult terrain on a regional scale. The investigation now has a king, a high garden, and a hydraulic system. The next piece of evidence almost shows them working together. Almost. A palace relief discovered at Nineveh shows a luxuriant royal landscape. Trees cover a wooded hillside. Water flows through channels. An aqueduct carries the supply toward cultivated ground. Architecture overlooks the scene from above. The image resembles the missing wonder more closely than anything securely recovered at Babylon. But the relief carries a caution. It dates to the reign of Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib's grandson, several decades after Sennacherib's death. The British Museum describes it as a luxurious, irrigated landscape, probably supplied by an aqueduct built by Sennacherib. It does not identify the scene as the Hanging Gardens. We cannot be certain it depicts Sennacherib's original garden rather than a later development, another royal park, or an idealized landscape created for palace display. Assyrian garden imagery carried political meaning. A royal garden showed that the king could command water, labor, foreign plants in distant ecosystems. Nature itself appeared subject to imperial will, yet the relief confirms the larger setting behind Sennacherib's inscriptions. Babylon offers late descriptions of an unidentified garden. Nineveh offers contemporary inscriptions, hydraulic infrastructure, and a near-contemporary image. The evidence has moved north. The name has not. For the Nineveh hypothesis to hold, the story had to cross hundreds of kilometers and move from the Tigris to the Euphrates. That sounds improbable. Classical geography makes it possible. Diodorus could place Nineveh beside the Euphrates, though it stood on the Tigris. Elsewhere, imagery assigned to Babylon resembles Assyrian hunting scenes more closely than anything found there. Ancient writers blended Assyrian rulers, Babylonian cities, Persian customs, and Semiramis. By the time Greek and Roman authors described the gardens, Nineveh was gone, and Babylon was the stronger name, tied to Nebuchadnezzar, imperial wealth, and Alexander's death. The theory requires no conspiracy, only an address error, repeated for centuries. A real Assyrian landscape may have entered oral or written tradition. The city fell. The story survived. Details from other gardens joined it, and Babylon's reputation pulled the resulting wonder south. Classical authors may also have preserved details from sources now lost, after the original context had disappeared. This is plausible. It is not documented step by step. No surviving writer records the transfer, and the missing bridge between the two cities remains the northern case's greatest weakness. Historical myths grow when a spectacular object outlives the precision of its address. The Nineveh hypothesis is powerful because it draws scattered evidence into coherence. That is precisely why it must be cross-examined point by point. The classical tradition calls the wonder Babylonian. Strabo explicitly links its irrigation to the Euphrates. Moving it to the Tigris requires layers of geographical error. Berossus was a Babylonian priest. His lost history connected the elevated garden with Nebuchadnezzar. He wrote centuries later and survives only through Josephus, but his testimony cannot be discarded simply because it complicates the northern theory. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe a high garden, yet never call it hanging, Babylonian, or one of the canonical wonders. The Ashurbanipal relief comes from a later reign. It confirms an Assyrian garden tradition, not one specific monument. And no complete foundation matching the classical descriptions has been securely identified at Nineveh. The city has stronger evidence for a spectacular royal garden, not an undisputed match. The wonder may even be a composite. An Assyrian mountain, vaults from another tradition, later irrigation technology, and a literary queen compressed into one impossible masterpiece. Nineveh has not solved the case. It has shown that the traditional verdict can no longer stand without challenge. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were not necessarily imaginary. Our certainty about them was. No contemporary inscription names Nebuchadnezzar as builder of the elevated wonder described by later authors. No securely identified foundation has been found in Babylon. The Amytis romance is not confirmed as contemporary history. The descriptions are late and contradictory. That overturns the schoolbook version as established fact. It does not prove Babylon never possessed an extraordinary royal garden. Nineveh offers the strongest alternative. Sennacherib described a high garden shaped like a mountain. His engineers created a hydraulic system. Later Assyrian art depicts an irrigated royal paradise supplied by an aqueduct. Babylon has the famous name. Nineveh has much of the physical dossier, but not proved in Babylon does not mean proved in Nineveh. No inscription identifies Sennacherib's garden as the canonical wonder. No surviving document explains how the tradition changed cities. The decisive bridge is missing. Future excavation may return the gardens to Babylon, strengthen Nineveh's claim, or leave the wonder suspended between a real garden and a legend assembled across centuries. The greatest mystery is no longer how ancient engineers raised the water. It is how memory lifted an entire wonder from its foundations and set it beside the wrong river. History may not have invented the garden. It may simply have given it the wrong address.